The plasma cutter hummed in Damon's hands as he worked through another boring day at the Helix 7 mining station. Same routine, different asteroid. Check the equipment, fix what's broken, try not to fall asleep standing up. The pay was decent enough to keep him out here in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by alien co-workers who mostly kept to themselves. Damon had been fixing mining gear for 3 years now, ever since he left Earth looking for something more exciting than a desk job. Turns out, space maintenance wasn't much more thrilling than Earth maintenance, but at least the view was better. Through the station's windows, he could see the endless black dotted with distant stars, and sometimes that made the tedious work worth it. Today felt different though. His plasma beam was acting up, cutting deeper than it should. Instead of just trimming the damaged hull plating, it was slicing right through into empty space behind the asteroid wall. That was weird. The geological surveys showed solid rock for at least 50 meters in every direction. When the beam finally cut through completely, Damon expected to see more rock. Instead, his headlamp illuminated something that made him step back and rub his eyes. Not just any ice, but crystal clear, ancient ice that seemed to glow with its own inner light. And there was something big frozen inside it. Damon moved closer, pressing his face to the smooth ice surface. The thing trapped inside looked like something from the scary stories his grandmother used to tell him as a kid. Massive wings folded against a serpentine body that had to be at least 50 feet long. Scales that caught light that wasn't even there, shifting from deep purple to silver as he moved his headlamp around. Claws that could probably tear through the station's hull like paper. The creature's head was enormous, easily the size of Damon's entire workspace. Its eyes were closed, but even in frozen sleep, there was something regal about its features. This wasn't just some space monster. This thing looked intelligent, maybe even noble, despite being terrifying enough to give him nightmares. Behind him, Damon heard footsteps as his shift supervisor, a 6-armed Catharian named Zix, came to check on the plasma cutter malfunction. The alien took one look at the ice tomb and started making sounds that Damon had learned meant extreme panic. Within seconds, Zix was running back down the corridor, shouting in 3 different languages at once. More footsteps echoed through the station as word spread. Damon could hear the universal translators picking up fragments of panicked conversations. Void Dragon kept coming up, along with words that roughly translated to run, death, and we're all doomed. The mining facility, which had been bustling with activity just minutes before, suddenly went quiet except for the sound of various alien species evacuating as fast as their legs, tentacles, or hover platforms could carry them. Damon found himself alone with the frozen creature, and honestly, he wasn't sure what all the fuss was about. Sure, it looked dangerous, but it was also clearly stuck in a block of ice that was probably older than human civilization. It wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He'd always been the curious type, which had gotten him into trouble more than once back on Earth. His mom used to say he'd pet a wild bear if he thought it looked friendly enough. Maybe she was right, because instead of running like everyone else, Damon found himself tapping his knuckles against the ice wall. "Hey there, big guy," he said, feeling a little silly for talking to what was basically a frozen statue. "Looks like you've been having a rough time. How long have you been stuck in there?" The ice seemed to pulse with that strange inner light, and for just a moment, Damon could have sworn he saw something flicker behind those massive closed eyelids. But that was impossible. This thing had probably been frozen for centuries, maybe longer. Still, something made him keep talking as he examined the ice formation, looking for the best way to free whatever was trapped inside. After all, if it had been a person stuck in there, he wouldn't have hesitated to help. Why should this be any different just because it happened to be big, scaly, and apparently legendary enough to make an entire mining station evacuate? Deep within the crystalline prison, something ancient stirred for the first time in 1,000 years, drawn by the sound of a voice that held no fear, only genuine concern for a stranger's well-being. Damon adjusted his plasma cutter to the lowest setting and started working on the ice with the patience of someone who'd spent years fixing delicate machinery. The facility's emergency lights cast eerie shadows as he worked alone, the evacuation alarms still echoing through empty corridors. Every few minutes, he'd pause and talk to the frozen creature like it was an old friend. "Easy does it," he murmured, carefully directing the plasma beam along the ice formation's edges. "Don't want to accidentally nick you with this thing. I know how much plasma burns hurt, trust me on that one." Inside the crystalline prison, awareness crept back into a mind that had been dormant for a millennium. Virathan the Starrender, terror of the outer systems, bane of a dozen star empires, slowly began to remember what it felt like to exist. The return of consciousness should have brought rage, should have filled him with the burning desire for vengeance that had sustained him through centuries of exile. Instead, He found himself listening to this strange little creature's voice with growing confusion. The being was humming some sort of melody while it worked, occasionally stopping to ask questions like, "How's the temperature? Not too hot, I hope? And almost got your left wing free there, buddy?" Nobody had ever called Virathan buddy before. In his thousands of years of existence, the reactions to his presence had always been the same. Terror, worship, desperate attempts at bargaining. Sometimes all three at once. But casual friendliness? That was completely outside his experience. As feeling slowly returned to his massive limbs, Virathan prepared himself for the familiar routine. He would roar his awakening to the cosmos, spread his wings to blot out the stars, and watch his entire fleet scramble to either flee or destroy him. The galaxy would remember why his kind had once been feared above all other things. But this small creature kept talking, and somehow that changed everything. "You know, I've been thinking," Damon said, switching to a smaller cutting tool for the more delicate work around the dragon's head. "Being frozen for who knows how long, you're probably pretty hungry when you wake up. I've got some energy bars in my toolbox. They taste like cardboard, but they'll keep you going until we can figure out something better." Virathan's ancient mind struggled to process this. The creature was planning to feed him? Not flee, not attack, not even demand tribute, but share food? The concept was so alien that for a moment, the dragon wondered if he was still dreaming. "There we go," Damon said with satisfaction as the last chunk of ice fell away from Virathan's massive form. "Bet that feels better. You've been in there a long time, haven't you? Your scales have got that really old look to them, like ancient armor or something." Virathan stretched wings that hadn't moved in 1,000 years, his joints creaking like the hull of an old starship. His body filled the entire excavation chamber, scales shimmering as they caught the light from Damon's work lamps. He looked down at this tiny being who had freed him, expecting to see the usual terror in its eyes. Instead, he saw curiosity and something that looked suspiciously like concern. "Can you understand me?" Damon asked, stepping back politely to give the massive creature room to move. "I mean, you look pretty intelligent. Way more intelligent than the space whales we sometimes see out here." Virathan opened his mouth, intending to release the roar that would announce his return to the galaxy. The sound that emerged was more like a confused rumble. This wasn't how his awakening was supposed to go. Where were the screaming crowds? The fleeing ships? The desperate attempts to destroy him before he could destroy them? "Yeah, I bet your throat's pretty dry," Damon said, completely misinterpreting the sound. "Hang on, I think I've got some water in my emergency kit. It's not much, but it might help." As Damon rummaged through his toolbox, Virathan found himself studying this peculiar creature. It was small even by the standards of most spacefaring species, with no visible weapons or armor. Its skin was a warm brown color, and its movements were efficient but unhurried. Most remarkably, it showed absolutely no signs of fear or aggression. When Damon turned back around with a water bottle, he found himself looking directly into eyes like burning stars. For a moment, both beings simply stared at each other across the vast gulf of their different existences. "So," Damon said finally, "got a name?" "I'm Damon, by the way. Probably should have introduced myself earlier, but I was kind of focused on the whole not accidentally cutting you situation." The simple question shattered something inside Virathan's ancient heart. "Virathan," the dragon said, his voice echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. "I am called Virathan the Starrender, destroyer of the Outer Rim, terror of 1,000 worlds." Damon nodded thoughtfully as if someone had just told him they worked in accounting. "That's quite a mouthful. Mind if I just call you Virathan? Those other titles sound pretty heavy to carry around all the time." The dragon blinked slowly. In all his centuries, no one had ever suggested his titles were inconvenient. They were meant to inspire fear, to remind the galaxy of his terrible power. But this human seemed to view them more like an unnecessarily long job description. "You are not afraid," Virathan observed, still trying to understand this strange reaction. "Should I be?" Damon asked, pulling a thermal blanket from his emergency kit. It was laughably small compared to the dragon's massive form, but he offered it anyway. "Here, thought you might be cold after being frozen for so long. I know it's not much, but it's better than nothing." Virathan stared at the tiny blanket. The gesture was so absurd, so impossibly kind, that he found himself accepting it despite its complete inadequacy. No one in the history of the galaxy had ever offered him comfort. "I have destroyed entire star systems," Virathan said, as if explaining why the blanket might not be necessary. "Yeah," Damon said, settling down on a nearby crate and opening his lunch box. "Well, I once accidentally flooded my neighbor's apartment trying to fix a leaky pipe. We all make mistakes. Want half my sandwich? It's just peanut butter and jelly, but you look like you haven't eaten in forever. The dragon's ancient mind reeled. This creature was offering to share food with someone who had just admitted to planetary destruction. Either humans were the most foolishly brave species in the galaxy, or they were completely insane. Before Virathan could respond, the facility's alarms suddenly blazed to life with renewed intensity. Heavy footsteps thundered through the corridors as Galactic Council security forces stormed the mining station in full combat gear. "This is Security Commander Thax," a voice boomed over the facility's speakers. "We have reports of a Class X entity awakening. All personnel maintain safe distance while we assess the threat." Damon sighed and stood up, brushing crumbs off his work clothes. "Great. The space police are here. This is about to get complicated." A squad of heavily armed soldiers rounded the corner, their weapons already charging with deadly energy. Commander Thax, a tall reptilian being with scales that shifted from green to gray, pointed his plasma rifle directly at Virathan. "Stand away from the creature, human," Thax ordered. "That entity is responsible for the destruction of the Kepler colonies 3 centuries ago." "Hold up there, Commander," Damon said, stepping between the soldiers and Virathan without hesitation. "Nobody's destroying anything. We were just having lunch and getting acquainted." "You don't understand the danger," Thax insisted, keeping his weapon trained on the dragon. "Void dragons are unpredictable killers. It could incinerate you without warning." "His name is Virathan," Damon said firmly, "and he's been nothing but polite since I helped him out of that ice. Maybe instead of pointing guns at him, we could try asking what happened back then." The security team exchanged glances. None of them had expected to find a human casually defending a legendary monster while offering it sandwiches. "The human is correct," Virathan said suddenly, his deep voice making the soldiers take a step back. "I have shown no aggression. Perhaps it is time someone listened to the full story." "See," Damon said, turning back to the dragon. "That's the spirit. Communication solves more problems than plasma rifles." Commander Thax lowered his weapon slightly, confusion evident in his reptilian features. You're not going to attack?" "I am tired of being misunderstood," Virathan said, settling back against the chamber wall. "For too long, fear has been the only language between my kind and yours. Perhaps this human has shown me there might be another way." Damon grinned and sat back down on his crate. "Now we're getting somewhere. How about you tell us your side of things, Virathan? And Commander, maybe your people could put the weapons away? Kind of hard to have a friendly conversation when everyone's ready to start shooting." The security forces reluctantly powered down their weapons, though they remained ready for trouble. What followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history, a peaceful conversation between a legendary terror and the species that had feared him for centuries, mediated by a human mechanic with a talent for seeing past scary reputations to the person underneath. The mining facility's break room had never hosted anything quite like this before. Virathan's massive form barely fit through the doorway, his wings folded tight against his body as he settled onto the reinforced floor. Damon sat across from him at a table that suddenly seemed ridiculously small, refilling his coffee cup while Commander Thax and his security team watched from a respectful distance. "So let me get this straight," Damon said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "You and your people weren't actually trying to conquer anyone? You were trying to warn them?" Virathan's ancient eyes dimmed with old pain. "For eons we watched the spaces between stars. We knew what lived in the dark places, what fed on reality itself. The Devourers, we called them. Creatures that existed in the gaps between dimensions, always hungry, always searching for ways into our universe." The dragon's voice carried the weight of millennia as he continued. "When the younger species began spreading across the galaxy, building their civilizations on worlds that bordered the void spaces, we tried to warn them. But how do you explain cosmic horror to beings who have never seen beyond their own solar systems?" "I'm guessing they didn't take it well when giant dragons showed up at their doorstep," Damon said. "Every world we approached, every system we tried to protect, they saw only monsters descending from the darkness. Their fear made them attack first and ask questions never. We would arrive speaking of ancient threats, and they would hear only the roars of conquest." Commander Thax shifted uncomfortably. "The historical records show massive destruction wherever void dragons appeared. Entire colonies wiped out." "Yes," Virathan admitted, his massive head lowering. "When diplomacy failed repeatedly, when our warnings were met with weapons fire, some of my brothers and sisters grew angry. They began to think, if these species insist on seeing us as destroyers, perhaps that is what we should become." Damon set down his coffee cup. But you didn't agree with that. I fought alongside them at first. When the Kepler colonies fired their planetary defense systems at our diplomatic envoy, killing 3 of my kin before we could even speak, rage consumed me. I struck back. The destruction was terrible, and it only confirmed their worst fears about us. The room fell silent except for the hum of the facility's life support systems. Even the hardened security troops seemed affected by the dragon's obvious remorse. After that, Virathan continued, I realized we had become the very thing we were trying to protect the galaxy from. We were so focused on the greater threat that we had become a threat ourselves. So I made a choice that split my people forever. What kind of choice? Damon asked gently. Exile. I convinced as many of my kind as I could that we should withdraw from the galaxy entirely. Better to let the younger species face the devourers unprepared than to become their destroyers ourselves. We scattered to the far reaches of space, seeking places where we could wait and watch without being seen as threats. And you ended up frozen in an asteroid, Damon said. I sought out the deepest ice I could find and I went to sleep. I thought perhaps if I slept long enough, the galaxy might evolve past its fear. Or the devourers might return, and my awakening would serve as a final warning. Commander Thack stepped forward. You mention these devourers as if they're still a threat. Our scientists have never detected anything like what you describe. Virathan's eyes suddenly blazed with ancient fear. Because they exist between spaces. They touch our reality only when they feed. But the signs are returning. I can feel them at the edge of my consciousness, testing the barriers that keep them in the void. What kind of signs? Damon asked, leaning forward with genuine interest rather than skepticism. Reality distortions in deep space. Stars that flicker not because they're dying, but because something is feeding on the space around them. Ships that disappear completely from existence, not destroyed but simply unwritten from reality. The security commander pulled out a data pad and began typing rapidly. There have been reports of unusual spatial anomalies in the outer systems. Ships going missing without any wreckage or distress signals. Command attributed them to equipment failures or pirate attacks. Pirates cannot erase ships from existence itself, Virathan said grimly. The devourers are stirring. They have found new gaps in reality's fabric, and they are beginning to push through. Damon was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd heard. Finally he looked up at the massive dragon. So what do we need to do about it? The simple question, asked without doubt or disbelief, broke through the last of Virathan's ancient walls. For the first time in 1,000 years, the dragon felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. 3 weeks later, the Helix 7 mining facility looked nothing like the quiet operation it had been before. What started as a simple equipment repair had turned into the most unlikely military preparation in galactic history. Damon stood in the main hangar, watching crews of humans and aliens work side by side, retrofitting mining equipment into weapons that could fight things that barely existed. Hand me that gravity manipulator, Damon called out to his assistant, a young woman named Keisha who had volunteered to help when word spread about what they were building. If Virathan's right about these things existing between dimensions, we need something that can anchor them to our reality long enough to fight them. The dragon himself was coiled around the facility's central support structure, his massive form serving as both advisor and early warning system. Every few hours he would lift his great head and announce that the disturbances were getting stronger, that reality was becoming thinner at the system's edge. The tiers are widening, Virathan reported, his voice echoing through the facility's communications system. I estimate we have perhaps 2 days before the first devourer breaks through completely. Commander Thax approached Damon's workstation, shaking his reptilian head in disbelief. I still cannot believe we are preparing for war based on the word of a creature we feared for centuries. Sometimes the people we're most afraid of are the ones trying hardest to protect us, Damon replied, not looking up from his work. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? We build some cool equipment and nothing shows up? I can think of worse ways to spend a few weeks. The truth was, Damon had seen enough evidence to convince him. Ships had been disappearing throughout the outer systems just as Virathan predicted. Not destroyed, not captured, but simply gone as if they had never existed at all. The Galactic Council's best scientists were baffled, but Virathan's explanations made perfect sense to someone who fixed broken things for a living. Reality has weak spots, just like any other system, Damon had explained to the mixed crews working on their improvised defenses. If something's punching holes in it, we need to patch those holes and maybe punch back a few times ourselves. The mining lasers became reality stabilizers, designed to reinforce the fabric of spacetime around weak points. The gravity wells used for asteroid capture were modified into dimensional anchors that could hold interdimensional entities in place long enough to fight them. Even the simple plasma cutters were upgraded with frequency modulators that could theoretically cut through the barrier between dimensions. It was crazy, impossible, and completely untested. In other words, exactly the kind of solution humans were famous for throughout the galaxy. When the sensors finally detected the first major reality distortion at the system's edge, Damon was ready. The small fleet of converted mining ships launched from Helix, 7 with crews made up of humans, aliens, and one very large dragon who had somehow squeezed himself into the cargo bay of the lead vessel. "Remember, people," Damon's voice crackled over the communication system as they approached the distortion. "We're not trying to destroy this thing. We're just trying to convince it to go home and leave us alone." What they found waiting for them defied every law of physics Damon had ever learned. The Devourer wasn't quite there and wasn't quite not there, existing in the spaces between moments, feeding on the reality around it. Stars flickered like dying light bulbs as the creature drained the very concept of existence from the space around them. "Deploying reality anchors," called out Jamal, one of the human pilots who had joined their desperate mission. "Whatever this thing is, it really doesn't like being forced to exist in one dimension." The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. The Devourer lashed out with tendrils of unreality, trying to erase their ships from existence entirely. But Damon's modifications held, the reality stabilizers keeping their vessels firmly anchored to the dimension they belonged in. "It's working," Keisha shouted over the communication system. "The dimensional anchors are holding it in place." That was when Virathan made his move. The ancient dragon unleashed a roar that contained 1,000 years of stored power, a sound that existed in multiple dimensions at once and struck the Devourer like a physical blow. The creature reeled backward, its grip on their reality weakening. But the effort was too much for even a void dragon. Virathan collapsed, overwhelmed by the psychic feedback from the interdimensional entity. The Devourer began to recover, pressing forward again with renewed hunger. Damon didn't hesitate. He piloted his small mining craft directly between the dragon and the cosmic horror, taking the full force of the creature's reality-warping assault. "Nobody hurts my friend," he grunted, fighting to maintain consciousness as the Devourer tried to erase his very existence. That simple act of friendship, of one small human protecting an ancient dragon, gave Virathan the strength he needed for one final effort. With a sound that shattered the barriers between dimensions, the dragon banished the Devourer back to the void where it belonged. As the space around them stabilized, other shapes began appearing throughout the system. Dragons, emerging from hiding places they had maintained for centuries, drawn by their brother's call and the proof that the galaxy had finally found beings willing to stand with them against the darkness. The age of fear was over. The age of cooperation had begun.